Beside a beautiful lake in County Monaghan, over there on the north side, Northern Ireland. Here, Southern Ireland. The site, actually, of Castle Leslie is one of considerable antiquity. In fact, over the centuries, there have been a number of castles built one on the other. At one time, it was MacMahon country, before the 17th century flight of the Earls, and then it was granted to a Sir Thomas Ridgway, and then bought by the celebrated fighting bishop, John Leslie, a great royalist. He faced up to Cromwell at every possible turn, and in fact, at the age of 90, he apparently rode from Chester to London to see the coronation of his king. Looking at Castle Leslie, what is it? It's not Palladian, it's not Georgian. In fact, it's an amalgam of several things. It could be just a little bit of the Italian Renaissance with some of the carved details over the doors and round the windows, baronial Scottish, and a grand Victorian pile. It was put up to the order of Sir John Leslie MP, using the services of Sir Charles Lanyon and William Henry Lynn, work starting in 1870 and apparently with the date of the front door finishing in 1878. Tacked on to the east side of Castle Leslie is an architectural feature which brings some distinction. It is the loggia, or cloisters, said to have been copied from that designed by Michelangelo for the Santa Maria d'Angeli in Rome. And here on the walls are various pieces and bits of stone and carving brought back by members of the family. I find this quite interesting, the lettered slab there, reminiscent of the lettering on the Trajan column, which was the father of all the Roman alphabets that we use today. Corinthian capital, coats of arms from families probably even long forgotten. Something a bit different here. It's got a Flemish look about it. Looks rather like the work of Hans Memling, the great painter of the 15th century, with the spread of the angel's wings. And down below, not Flemish, but I think Germanic. It's either Cologne or Würzburg, with a group of figures, some badly disfigured. And fragments of decorative festoons and swags found beside or torn off goodness knows what building, in what country, and what date. There's limestone, there's sandstone, and something even softer. And more coats of arms. And it only seems just a little strange to me that the only really important one missing is that of the Medicis. The front entrance of Castle Leslie is very different from the pure lines of the loggia. Here it's a big statement in rough dressed stone, a little softening with the sandstone arch, the Ionic capitals. From the comparative warmth of the porch and portico into the entrance hall, and the atmosphere has a chill, largely I would think caused by the big mosaic pavement, which is made up of tens of thousands of little tiny fragments of coloured marble. It's a copy from one in Pompeii. You can see the acanthus leaves going around the oval, and in the centre there's a drinking bowl on legs being used by 3 doves. In the corners, pitchers with what might be ferns, but I think more likely represent an octopus. But certainly the most striking feature in the entrance hall is this very fine head and shoulders of our Lord by Francavilla, late 16th century. And it demonstrates very well how a skilled hand can achieve a marvellous plasticity with the hard white Carrara marble. Note the clothes, the face itself, the hair, and the sensitivity of the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Behind, the head of a young lady. No name is known, but she shows very much the attractive hairstyle of the Roman Pompeii ladies, most elegant, and perhaps one day that'll be back with us. And high up on the end wall is the coat of arms of the Leslie family, a somewhat complicated affair with all the quarterings. The buckles and the gripfast, according to the Leslie family records, were granted to them by Queen Margaret of Scotland. The main staircase in the castle is a sturdy construction of oak, the balusters picking up the Ionic motif. And on the half landing, there's a very powerful head and shoulders in dark patinated bronze. It's of Sir Shane Leslie and was done by Claire Sheridan, his cousin. Close by, in a little gilt oval frame, the last pen that was owned by Pope Pius IX. He it was who in 1870 lost the Papal States and ended up as a prisoner in the Vatican. On the wall here, a very pleasing collection of sketches and topographical drawings by Buchner and Sir John Leslie. Segovia with the cathedral, powerful penwork with a broad nib, and it's almost a monochrome in pleasing browns. Another view from Spain, Zaragoza, also by Sir John Leslie, this time pure watercolour, and it illustrates the transparency with water and skies that can be achieved when the medium is used like that. Above, a little sketch of a famous model, Peppino by Buchner, and next to it, I think my favourite here, it's also by Sir John Leslie. Of course, it shows a view across the alluvial plain that carries that noble city of Florence. And you can see the Duomo and the great Campanile of Giotto's there. Just a little bit of heightening here and there with Chinese white. And one other one here of two rather exciting-looking figures. Again, it's Buchner. And these are two sons of a famous brigand. Look at the strength he's got into that head. Marvellous piece of character rendering. The staircase leads ultimately to some 36 bedrooms, of which this, the so-called mauve room, is probably one of the more delicately decorated. In fact, it was done like this in 1907 for a visit by the Duke and Duchess of Connaught, and has been left exactly as they would have seen it. The bed with a slight canopy, with a lovely cretonne on it. Then the massive wardrobe carrying the date of 1878, the year when the house was actually completed. On the end wall, a pleasant fluted white marble mantelpiece, and on top of it, an example of Irish chinoiserie in the Chippendale manner. And also on the mantelpiece, two rather lovely pieces from the Meissen manufactory, the reclining boy and girl set for some rustic idyll. They're holding pierced ware bowls which could have been used for bonbons. But let's look at some of the exquisitely painted detail on their costumes. The story of Castle Leslie is entwined with the names of many of the famous, who often came from afar to visit the family. In the evenings, at the sound of the first gong, they would have gone to their rooms to change for dinner. And then, at the sound of the second summons, they would come down these stairs and head for the dining room. The dining room has a sense of relaxation with the dark green papered walls, the coved and checkered ceiling, held up by a substantial cornice with assorted classical mouldings and a festoon-filled frieze. It's a room for conversation, a place of memories, with portraits of members of the family who have played their part in the weave of the Leslies. To the left of the fireplace hangs a commanding likeness of Lady Constance by that gifted painter, de Laszlo. His technique is virile and decisive. Viewed near to, fine details dissolve into a form of legerdemain put in with sweeping strokes. Matching this is a second de Laszlo on the right of the white marble fireplace. With this portrait, de Laszlo accentuates the masculinity of the sitter. There's an underlying strength with the expression, the cast of the jaw, the hand. Works included here have been gathered from Far Eastern sources. A coromandel lacquered screen of 10 leaves stands all of 9 feet tall. The technique here has involved a degree of chiseling into the support to achieve the third-dimensional effect. The application of the colored lacquers would have involved stiffening the colors with large amounts of shellac. On a serving table sits, squats, or reclines a fulsome figure of Buddha, wreathed with a spreading, joy-filled smile, his robes rich with decoration. As a complement to the Buddha, a tall figure of a mandarin rests on the mantelpiece. The modelling here is of a much freer manner. There's a sense of flowing movement with the gown, which contrasts with the air of authority in the face of the great ruler, symbolic of the power such figures once wielded. And now he sits, casting a benign eye over the diners in Castle Leslie. When you look at the outside of Castle Leslie, you really get very little idea of what to expect when you come in. Scale is difficult to judge. But when you come into this noble chamber, the gallery, with its slightly coved ceiling with the checkerboard ribs and the cornice repeating what we've just seen in the dining room, one gets a feeling of atmosphere and spaciousness. And particularly at this end, it's of great interest, where there's a transverse beam held up by 2 columns of what's called scagliola. That's a man-made marble in which fragments of marble are pressed into a cement which has things like isinglass into it, polished. It was a great favourite of Robert Adam. And they're surmounted by some quite interesting Ionic capitals. On the back wall, pilasters, again Ionic, and they frame really a rather fine Flemish tapestry, Brussels, early 17th century. And it shows an incident from the life of King Solomon. Well, when one thinks of Brussels, early 17th century, one could imagine perhaps painters of the stature of Rubens having something to do with the design, because it was the custom to employ first-rate masters for these tapestries, with the peacocks up at the top pecking over a beautiful display of very lavish fruit. It is lavish from the gown of the king to the figures at the sides with barrels on their heads with more fruit. Amongst the objects in this room, there's a pair of 16th century Italian chairs, I suppose one could say bishop's chairs, noteworthy, I think, in that they still preserve remnants of the original velvet upholstery. Imagine how marvellous this back must have been with the red pile of the velvet and the embroidery there of gold and silver threads. But if a collector came into this room, I think he would pause at this piece, which is actually a Spanish abbess's varguena, a type of travelling desk. In fact, you can see the great handles at the side there. This, I would think, is a dense, dark Spanish oak and a very adequate hasp in metal to hold it together. But looking at it, what's strange about it? It's 16th century. If it was Flemish or German or Italian, the decoration would be ebullient with plant forms, probably little figures carved and things like that. This is all abstract. Well, during the 16th century, Spain was still overrun with the Moors, with their Mohammedan beliefs that it was evil to use human form or natural form. So the whole thing is abstract, but nevertheless rich with the inlays of the ebony and ivory there and the red paint, and how marvellous it must have looked when it was freshly gilt. And on top, a head and shoulders of the god Mercury. But if one studies it, I think one thinks, no, that's not dating from the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. It's much more likely to have been carved in the late 17th or beginning of the 18th centuries as a bait for the marauding lords and ladies who went on these collecting rituals, the grand tour of Europe. And over the fireplace, a very large canvas. There's no known actual painter. It's Dutch, and it's the kind of work which would have been produced in quite large quantities as wall covering. And to the left of it, high up there, a likeness of that fighting bishop, Bishop John Leslie, a very moral and strong man. The Leslie coat of arms appears in many places throughout the castle, but perhaps nowhere quite so decoratively set as in the back of this great throne. At one time it was in a princely house in Florence and was reserved for papal visits. The drawing room is a spacious place, one end a large bow window, the ceiling slightly coved with geometric ribbing, and a rather pleasant festooning round the frieze. I suppose the contents of the drawing room are by far the most fascinating. They're the garnerings of various intellectual minds of the family as they walked or rode their way round Europe. There are several quite notable pieces of furniture. This cabinet here in particular, it's Italian, and I think it shows the exuberance and invention of some of those early craftsmen. Little figures here with considerable dimension to them. You can put your hand in behind the legs, but there's hardly a square inch on that cabinet which has got no decoration at all, whether it's low relief or look at the handles. That bird's looking that way, that one this way. And the little figure acts as a pull for the door in the centre, small drawers which probably could have contained jewels or secret papers. But I love this Italian oak because after a couple of 100 years or so, it gets this marvellous deep Van Dyke brown, almost black look to it. And another piece of Italian craftsmanship, some 300 years plus, Florence, a coffer. Again, the invention of the moulding here, the leaf patterning. On the top, though, it's quite superb. There's an oval with a big bearded head. There's two other heads each side with flowing locks and shouting lips. And look at these beasts here, this beautiful dragon bird with flowing wings and tail. And there's something from a medieval bestiary, a great flying dragon with bosoms. And over both these pieces are mirrors in what is termed the Irish Chippendale style. Wood covered in gesso and then gilt, highly decorative and well carried out with the Rococo Baroque curves. And just look at those lovely birds up at the top. On one of the side walls, there's another mirror which I think rather outclasses perhaps the Irish Chippendale. This is Italian, I would think late 17th century, and it epitomizes all the bravura and flamboyance of the Rococo period that followed the Baroque. The forms have no recognizable inspiration except perhaps exuberance and joy. I mentioned earlier that there's some strange objects one could come across in the drawing room, such, for example, as a little cheap porcelain figure of Winston Churchill. Whatever's he doing here? Well, in the latter part of the 19th century, the Leslie family tree becomes extremely tangled and convoluted. For instance, it goes across the Atlantic, gets mixed up with the Jeromes, cousins proliferate. One of the cousins was his mother. And there's an intimate memory of the great man here with this little child's frock he probably wore when he was about a year or a year and a bit. It's beautiful, soft, white cambric, with almost the feeling and texture of silk. And the embroidery work is extremely fine, as also is the pierced and broderie anglaise. That is very much in contrast with this over here, which appears to be a crumpled piece of scarlet flannel. But it's scarlet flannel with a tragic memory. In 1716, Lord Derwentwater became the last Catholic in England to be executed. And in that year, he mounted the execution platform, and he was asked if he would abjure his faith, and he replied, no, the price is too great. After the axe had fallen, the still bleeding head was picked up and wrapped up in this as a shroud, and you can see the dark stains of the ancient blood which have rotted through. I mentioned earlier about the people going on the grand tour, and at the height of this craze, it's quite extraordinary how many people would brave the waters of the channels, the creaking coaches, and even horseback to go out gathering culture. They were, I think, connoisseur dilettanti collectors rather than collectors today who all too often just study price tags. They were generally interested in it without head and arms, stands about 9 feet tall. This copy is in probably plaster of Paris, but still it holds something of the mystery of movement. You can almost feel the winds and the passage of things past it. It stands on a table, which I think is interesting because it's got a carved decoration very dissimilar to that at the end of the room. Here, the carving is very simple, the forms are very pure, and the whole thing has a feeling of freshness. There's 2 cherubs or small children holding up the top, and there's this great sense of quality with it. I suppose every house has within it a gem which is precious, and Castle Leslie is no exception. This fireplace, I think most people would probably recognize as Della Robbia. It's almost unique because there's actually only one other in the world. The Della Robbia method of decoration of terracotta was quite unique and unusual. It was developed in the early part of the 15th century by Luca, and he made these glazes, particularly that lovely blue and the rather strange white. It's interesting to note that if you look at whites with ceramics, they very seldom are dead white, and thus it is here. You've got this very subtle tinge to it. He also had other glazes, such as the yellows and greens with the fruit swags there, but most of all, one recognizes it by the blue and white. This fireplace actually was not by Luca, it was by his nephew, Andrea. And how did it come here? Well, one of those Leslies out on a collecting tour met a man apparently on a road near Florence with a handcart, and on the handcart was this masterpiece. It had been taken out of a house and been replaced, believe it or not, with a plain grey marble fireplace. Too good a chance to be missed. £20 was the price paid for something which today is almost priceless. We began our look at Castle Leslie from the shores of Glasslough. For over 100 years, this beautiful, green, peaceful place has attracted people. Writers, George Moore, Keats, Thackeray, painters, John Everett Millais, Lavery, seeking perhaps inspiration from the fountain of imagination that has fired the Leslie family. Their castle, their mansion, their baronial hall sits beside this beautiful lake, or perhaps in thought sits on an island surrounded by the waters of a highly personal and private pool of fantasy.